I'm very pleased to see your interest in the book which we are going to present today within what has become a very successful ZMO book launch series. Our today's guest is Ali Raza, Associate Professor of History at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Lahore University of Management and Sciences, LUMS. Good afternoon to you, Ali, and we are very pleased to have you here with us today. Ali Raza is a historian specializing in the history of modern South Asia. He received his PhD from the University of Oxford. His research and teaching interests include the social and intellectual history of South Asia, comparative colonialisms, decolonization, and post-colonial theory. Ali Raza was for a number of years a research fellow at the Leibniz-Zentrum Zentrum Moderne Orient in Berlin until 2018. And during his time at ZMO, Ali has been working within the former research unit Trajectories of Lives and Knowledge. Currently, he is working at Lahore at LUMS. Alongside his teaching and research, Dr. Raza is also the co-curator and co-founder of the LUMS Digital Archive. This archive is dedicated to collecting, cataloging, and preserving materials of historical significance in Pakistan and making them freely accessible to students and researchers all over the world. Dr. Raza has published in a number of journals, such like Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, South Asia Journal of South Asian Studies, South Asian History and Culture, Contemporary South Asia. He is the co-editor of the Internationalist Moment, South Asia Worlds and Worldviews, 1917-1939, which came out in 2014, and the author of Revolutionary Past, Communist Internationalism in Colonial India, which was published last year with Cambridge University Press. And this is the book we are looking at today. We have agreed on a different format, and instead of having two longer presentations, I will interview our guest for about 40 minutes about his book. And we would like, with this way, to give you an impression about the content, the aim, and the main argument of the book. And this will then be followed by another 45 minutes where you all can ask your questions to Ali Raza. I have a request. Please do not write too much in the common chat while we speak, and keep your questions and remarks for the second half of this event. So my first question is simply, Ali, how would you introduce your book? It is advertised by Cambridge University Press as, and I quote, "In this engaging and innovative history of the Communist Movement in colonial India, Ali Raza reveals the lives, geographies, and anti-colonial struggles of Indian revolutionaries and how they sought to remake the world. Driven by the utopian visions of Communist Internationalism, Indian revolutionaries yearned and struggled for a global upheaval that would overthrow European imperialisms and radically transform India and the world. In an age marked by political turmoil, intellectual ferment, collapsing empires, and global conflicts, Indian revolutionaries stood alongside countless others in the colonized world and beyond in their desire to usher in a future liberated from colonialism and capitalism." Drawing from a wealth of archival materials, Raza demonstrates how communist internationalism was a crucial project in the struggle for national liberation and inaugurates a new approach to the global history of communism and decolonization. That's how Cambridge University Press advertised the book. I would like to add another point. Ali, you raise in your introduction. You situate the history of Indian communism within India through the life trajectories of Indian revolutionaries. Ordinary men, as you say, who come in touch with who come in touch with communist and revolutionary ideas. Central to your book is the argument that communism was not foreign to India. You rather foreground the question as to how your protagonists understood communism, made it their worldview and guiding principle. You bring this history back into the historiography of modern India and Pakistan, vis-a-vis, as you say, colonial and post-colonial states' attempts in delegitimizing communism in both India and Pakistan. And as you write in your introduction, nationalist histories in both countries sought to efface other histories of belonging, and prominent among them was the history of the left. The left in both countries was cast as a proxy of communist blocs and as an anti-national force, a term that has become even more amplified today. So that was a long introduction. Back to my question, how would you introduce your own book? What do you want the audience to know about your book, and why was it important for you to write this book?
Thank you, Heike, for the introduction, for the very generous introduction, not just of myself, but of the book as well. You've already provided one starting point for my research, and I suppose I can begin with another. But before I do so, let me just say that this is such an honor for me. Thank you so much for the opportunity. It is a homecoming for me in many ways. This is a book that would not have been possible without not just the archives at the ZMO, but also the camaraderie and the friendship at the center. And I wrote this book in 2017 while I was there for a year. I'm grateful to you. I'm grateful to Katrin. I'm grateful to all colleagues who are too numerous to name, to the administrative colleagues as well, to Silke, to Svenja, to Thomas. And really, all of this has been made possible by your company and by the community you provided. So I'm deeply grateful for that. And so in many ways, this is a ZMO book, the way that I like to think about it. And to give then now to turn to the starting point, as you mentioned, how does one attempt to explain the beginnings of this book? I suppose one of the starting point on top of what you mentioned is starting off from this sentiment of betrayal and disillusionment that accompanies partition and formal independence in South Asia. And then that is to basically suggest a very obvious kind of like point over here. That goes against, obviously, the triumphalism that is otherwise associated with independence, with freedom, with decolonization, if I may call it that. I have long been interested in, and that's part of also my second project as well, about the unfulfilled promise of independence, of freedom, and the unfulfilled potential, perhaps, and of those promises that were perceived to be unfulfilled and unmet and unkept. And so a big part of that, obviously, sentiment comes from what we would otherwise classify normatively as the left. And the communists are a huge part of that. And there's one slogan that actually united both the communists in India and Pakistan in the immediate aftermath of independence. And that remark went roughly along the lines of that this freedom is a lie. Ye azadi jhooti hai. That was the slogan. And so that, to me, was an interesting starting point, because I became interested in those visions, in those dreams, in those imaginations that led up to this event called 1947. And I suppose one can expand that and use it to think about national liberation struggles across the global South, which is to say, this in-betweenness between the moment that empire is considered to be a a phenomena that is on the retreat, that will disappear in due course, and yet you're still waiting for that imagined day, for that independence, for that freedom, for that liberation to come. And so this period, this in-betweenness, this period between, if I may paraphrase Hannah Arendt, between the no longer and the not yet, is a period that is full of immense, variety of ideas, of imaginations, of visions of what independence can and ought to look like. And in the interwar era, which is what my book is largely concerned with, the grandest project of all, by far, was the project of Communist Internationalism that sought to conceive of a world, of a post-imperial world that lay beyond, that conceived of political communities and political formations outside of the binary of colonized or colonized, outside of these otherwise what we would call nation status models of political community and structure and formation. And so these were individuals who became attracted to this idea. And my book, in some ways, I suppose, is a South Asian story of a global, of an otherwise global narrative and a global story and a global struggle called Communist Internationalism. And a key part of what drove these revolutionaries to communism and to Moscow was, again, in the promise that it held out for liberation, not just of India from the British Raj, but of the world from the legacy and the phenomena called imperialism and colonialism, and obviously its other kind of like complement, which was capitalism. And so, these are the visions, these are the ideas, these are the imaginations that I try to convey in my book. So that, I suppose, is one introduction. And before I end, I would just like to point out that Communist Internationalism at that point is one, obviously, of other kinds of internationalisms that one finds not just in the interwar era, but also in the 50s and 60s, in the period leading up to decolonization in Africa and elsewhere. I have in mind, for example, Black internationalism. I have in mind figures like Marcus Garvey, Du Bois, Kwame Nkrumah, and others who again sought to think of a kind of internationalism that lay outside of that standard colonized or colonized binary, of that nation statist model, and so on. So in that sense, this book, I suppose, it's very much speaking to now an emerging scholarship that looks at those other visions of freedom that lay outside of that standard, idea of liberation struggle of a nation against its mother, country, its empire, and so this is an attempt to chart those ideas and those perhaps imaginations and ultimately those utopian visions. And this is where I place the book in terms of its larger conversation, in terms of thinking about those other visions that existed in the interwar era and afterwards.
Thank you, Ali. You now raise this big picture with the big movements and big visions and ideas. In your book, you very painstakingly explore the history of this communist movement in colonial India, but at its heart lies the historical account of people who were part of this movement and who struggled to be liberated from colonialism and capitalism, imperialism. What is interesting in your book, you bring global and personal questions together through life trajectories in the context of internationalism, of communist internationalism. You also bring big theoretical questions and international policy together with these life trajectories of these ordinary men who became internationalists and revolutionaries, who left their country in order to gain political experience, in order to learn revolution in the real sense of the word. These were men who struggled to create an utopia. By dealing with them, you highlight the many visions and dreams associated with freedom and national liberation in South Asia, as you now describe, their embeddedness in time and space, but also the obstacles and challenges your actors faced. And they were affiliated with global struggles against colonialism, against imperialism, later against fascism. They were combining nationalisms and internationalisms and navigating between both and not dividing them and not seeing them as contradiction. In other words, you tell very complicated life stories of these men in order to present a complicated and tangled social and political history. So my question would be, can you say a bit more about these actors? How did you choose them? How close do you come to them? Did you come to them through your research? Or could you give maybe one example of those actors who are at the center of your book?
Thank you for that, Heike. I think I can best explain this by starting off from the last part of your question, which is to give an example of one of these figures. And the example that immediately comes to my mind is of a figure called Dada Amir Haider Khan. This is someone who is born in what is now northwestern Pakistan, in a very small village, not much going on, other than people migrating outside to sell their labor, either in the military or working as some kind of like labor somewhere. He is born in 1900, and he runs away from home at a very young age. He's running away from an abusive stepfather. He catches a train, obviously without a ticket, to Bombay, where he has heard that one of his relatives has basically taken up residence, and he reaches Bombay in 1914, and there, in order to earn a living, he secures employment on board a merchant vessel, and he spends basically. And at that time, I mean, Indian labor is in huge demand on these merchant vessels that are also serving a military purpose because the First World War has broken out. And he becomes part of this army, literal army, which Professor Ravi Ahuja has also worked on, called the Lashkars, who then basically serve on these shipping vessels across much of the world. He spends the next few years serving on one vessel after another. That's also where he experiences war in what is now Iraq. And after the end of the war, he jumps ship and he basically flees into New York, and he basically tries to find another kind of living for himself. And part of the reason why he's on the run from shipping is because he's fed up, amongst other things, not just of the conditions on board these vessels, but he's also fed up of the visceral racism that he encounters on board these vessels. And Indian crews are treated in racially marked ways on board these vessels. And he runs away, from that life, and he spends the early 1920s basically, tramping across much of the United States until he eventually finds employment in Detroit, of all places. He works as a worker in one of those massive auto factories in Detroit, and there he gets involved with the Communist Party of the USA. And he gains membership of the CPUSA, and the CPUSA then, in line with another like Indian revolutionary network that is operating in the United States at the time, the Ghadar party, then decides to send Dada Amir Haider Khan to Moscow, which he reaches in 1925, along with 6 or 7 other Indian comrades in their search for revolutionary emancipation. And it's in Moscow that he spends the next few years of his life. Alongside learning like fluent Russian, he gains admission into the Communist University of the Toilers of the East, where he eventually graduates from. And then towards the end of the 1920s, he then sets sail, obviously undercover, to India, which is where he joins the CPI, the underground CPI. He still manages to make another trip or two to the Soviet Union after that, but he lives pretty much the rest of his life in India. He sets up shop in Madras, of all places, and this is the image of a Punjabi, a worker who's fluent in Russian, setting up study circles and workers groups in Madras. Never fails to astound me, and which is also in Madras where he is picked up and arrested. This is the late 1930s I'm talking about, and he spends much of the rest of his of his life in colonial India in jails. And that's also when he writes his autobiography, or at least the part that we have with us. This is someone who is alongside many other figures who animate, mostly men, some women too, who animate this book. And the reason why I was drawn to these figures, and I can also elaborate on that later on, but the one reason I was drawn to these figures was because I was really interested in probing the question of what communism looked like to them. Because usually, I mean, the kind of political histories that we have of communism in British India are usually political histories. There are political histories of parties, of institutions, and very frequently histories of elite men who contributed theoretically to the canon known as Marxist-Leninist thought. And these, on the other hand, are individuals who did not necessarily come up with fancy theories or treatises or ideas of philosophies. They're not your M. Roy or those figures that we usually hear of. These are figures who basically lay at the heart of the movement. It's these figures who embodied that communist ideal, that what it meant to be a communist, what it meant to be a revolutionary, and basically made communism a key part of the South Asian landscape. So in some ways, I was interested in asking the question of the communism of the everyday. That's what I was interested in. And to me, I could best answer that question of what communism looked like on the everyday basis, what communism looked like from the ground up, through the lives of these figures and their journeys, and what drove them to revolutionary politics. And so, that was one way to solve that riddle, which was to say, how can I get close to thinking about what communism meant on an everyday level, far beyond, obviously, what comes out from the party high command, from the treatises, from the philosophical, basically interventions that one otherwise encounters. To me, that was the question, and I can also again elaborate on why that question was important afterwards when I guess we speak about archives and so on. But that was one reason why I chose to concentrate on these figures.
Yeah, we will come to archives, I think, in a moment. You are a historian, and your book is about history. You explore history, but as good historical research tends to do, it is linked to present day South Asia, to regimes of memory and representations of the past you are talking about in India, in Pakistan. I have a question related to the title and the way you imagine this. The title of the book is Revolutionary Past. When reading the book, it seems to me that you talk a lot about futures, utopias, visions, dreams, commitments, and the actors you talk about are all fighting for a future of India free of colonial suppression within the context of the Comintern, later with the Soviet Union as a reference model for a common future they have in mind. And you also write at one point, they already live in the future, or they live in the future. And you as a historian moving back and forth between the now and the then, and between the time we live in, the time you live in, the needs of our time, and the responsibility you feel to tell this story. And you just now explained this very nicely to us, but to tell it not only with your eyes, but also with their views and perspectives, as you said. So again, my question here, why this title? Why not revolutionary ideas? And what is your perception about the intersection of historical times and lifetimes, personal lifetimes? And how do you place your protagonists, and maybe also yourself as a historian and author, between past, present, and futures?
I think that's a wonderful question, and I thank you for that so much. I don't know if I'll be able to do justice to it, but let me start off with myself and why this title, in a way, resonated with me. I belong to a generation. I grew up at a time. This was the 1980s, 1990s in Pakistan, where it seemed as if, when it came to at least progressive alternatives to leftist futures, it seemed as if the future had been exhausted. And I say that keeping in mind much of the larger global, in some ways, climate in the late 80s and early 90s, when the defeat of communism and the fall of the Soviet Union also signaled for the left at large a collapse of futurity as well, a collapse of imagination, a collapse of a sense of historicity. And what gave and what replaced it in some ways is this deep sense of cynicism and foreboding. And I'm drawing upon David Scott, who speaks of these post-colonial dystopias. I'm drawing upon Frederick Jameson, who thought deeply about this crisis, as he puts it, of imagination, this crisis of historicity. I'm drawing upon Svetlana Blum in her book on nostalgia, speaking of the Soviet Union and so on. So in some ways, that sense of futurity and what it held, the promise of the future, it gives way to, at best, perhaps a nostalgic reading of the past. And so what really amazed me, actually, was in first encountering these files in the archive was, and this one question that kept popping up for me was that, I mean, these guys can't be for real. I mean, what explains this ridiculous, what is a seemingly ridiculous kind of, urge to simply up stakes and leave your home and hearth. You are working as a migrant laborer in Argentina. You're originally from India, and you basically shut up shop and you basically go to Moscow in search of revolution and so on. And so these are figures who are otherwise portrayed as fantastical figures, as extraordinary figures, as hardly believable figures in the colonial archives, and not just colonial archives, but also in much of the history writing that emerges in its wake. And to me, the question really was, well, how do we take this seriously? Without making it sound as if it's some scene or a story out of some cloak and dagger like spy novel or thereabouts. And there actually, this question of the future and the time of now, which I shall elaborate on in a little bit, became important to me, because what I was really struck by was this confidence in a future that was theirs for the taking. At least that's what it seemed. And this is a political subjectivity. This is a political subject who's born out of a relationship with a particular conception of time. It's a time that is no longer tenable. It's a time that's no longer possible. It's a time that's no longer viable. And so for all intents and purposes, this is a time that they lived, that they inhabited, that was well on its way, that was well, basically, on its way to end. And so for all intents and purposes then, these are individuals who are ushering in the future. And in doing so, they're also obviously led by this conviction and this belief, this very Marxist belief in historical progress, in this idea that history has certain laws of movement, that we're all moving towards some kind of a future, some kind of a utopian horizon, and so on. So, all these are images, all these are visions that at least my generation, or the generation that grew up in the 90s and now, don't really share. We don't really have that confidence in that same way in that future. And so the title Revolutionary Past, at one level, it gestures to a past that is no longer with us. And so that past in that sense is truly past. But to me, still the question remains open, which is to say that what role does the past play in animating, in recharging this disaffected present? And what role can the past play in opening up more horizons for the future? And there I became interested in the relationship that these figures had with their past. And what struck me was, amongst other things, this very revolutionary practice, as they saw it. They called it revolutionary, which was to write their own histories. And these are histories that are serialized, not just in what you would identify as history books. These are histories that are also serialized in digests, in newspapers, in pamphlets, in leaflets, and so on. And these are histories that are very different from those colonial histories that always portrayed Indian subjects as backward, as primitive, as always being in the proverbial waiting room of history. And so there, what really struck with me was how their revolutionary past, as they saw it, was a way of animating and adding meaning to their present, and again, opening up the future for some kind of triumph, for some kind of victory for their cause that they believed in. And so in that sense, that past, their present, and their future were all intimately linked. And that's, I suppose, one way of answering that question. But the other way, I think, of thinking about this political subjectivity is to perhaps read out, if I may, a section that Heike, that you pointed out, might be useful to really convey this larger point. And I speak about this in the first chapter in the introduction of my book, where I'm thinking of what this political subjectivity is and what it is born out of. And there I use this idea that comes from Walter Benjamin, which is this conception of the Jetztzeit, the time of now, and what it meant to live in the time of now. And so in asking this question, as I said, I'm taking my lead from Walter Benjamin's conception of Jetztzeit in his thesis on the philosophy of history. For Benjamin, Jetztzeit signified a conception of time in which every moment was alive with radical possibilities that could fracture the present and liberate it from an otherwise recursive and hollowed out continuum of time. This was where the transformation of history could take place. And it is this intimate and affective relationship with time that interests me here. To illustrate this better, the figures animating this book became political subjects in an era in which the dominating discourse of empire claimed time and history for itself. Colonial subjects were either not worthy of freedom or were not worthy yet. Placed within an endlessly deferred and unrealizable temporal horizons, colonial subjects were destined to shuffle along endlessly under colonial tutelage before they would be deemed worthy of autonomy or freedom. In other words, they were destined to endlessly inhabit, to invoke Ernst Bloch, the time of the not yet, or what Dipesh Chakrabarty evocatively termed the waiting room of history. And yet, it is striking to see how many of the individuals in the story insisted on inhabiting the time of the now, far before the leaders of the Indian nationalist movement insisted on the same. Put differently, the time for freedom was a time of now, with every moment holding out the promise of transformation and revolution. In their understanding of their moment, these figures inhabited a revolutionary time in which anything was possible. Not only was a new world within reach, it was indeed well on its way. And for all intents and purposes then, the individuals in this book were already living in the future. And Moscow, amongst other places, was the proof of that future, that the future was already here. And it may have been delayed in the colonized world, but you know what? It was well on its way. And so it's that belief, that certainty, that conviction, actually, that to me explains a great deal about this particular kind of political subjectivity, political subjectivity that is otherwise loosely characterized as radical, as fanatical even, and as frankly odd and bizarre. And so this, in some ways, was an attempt to think about those political subjects in perhaps a different way.
Maybe we will come to Moscow as what would be a good example to answer the next question. I think we already heard a lot about the complexity and the messiness of the lives of your protagonists. The complexity is not only in the sense that they all live translocal lives, so they all traveled a lot, which means that you as a historian have to somehow follow their journeys. They not only traveled the world, and here I quote you say on page 154, they were among many such activists who seemed to straddle varied, ostensibly distinct, and occasionally opposed political movements which you also have to retrace in order to do justice to your actors. And this is what you do in your book. You bring together entangled histories, which in historiography are often dealt with in a separate way. but your actors were made in these interstices of these entangled histories, both national, like Akali movement, Kirti movement, Communist Congress, Muslim League, and international anti-colonial movement, anti-imperialist, anti-fascist, communist movement. And you say that especially the 1920s and 30s, where the focus of your book is mostly on, were striking for their flexible political arenas, and you speak of political fluidity, which one can trace in the biographies. Could you elaborate a bit on this aspect of your research, about the entanglements, the various entanglements you deal with, both in spatial and temporal sense? We talked about the times already, but the translocal aspect we did not touch so much. You mentioned America, you mentioned Moscow. What about these entanglements between North America, Southeast Asia, Moscow, and all of them with colonial India? But besides this, of course, I'm also thinking about the varieties and political movements that are brought together in the life trajectories of the revolutionaries.
No, thank you for that, Heike. And I think that's another way of thinking about why focusing on these small biographies, these individual biographies, also opens up those other questions, those other entanglements that you mentioned. One, obviously, entanglement that you identified is the political and the ideological. And there, obviously, one finds a lot more messiness. So what are the intersections between, for example, pan-Islamism and communism? What are the intersections between, Sikh, communitarian and religious movements and communism? Those become more evident, those become more messy, those become more overlapping, and they overlay on each other through the lives of these individuals. And so some of the figures that I look at, they start off their lives in the pan-Islamic movement, in the Khilafat movement. Others start off their political journeys in the Akali movement, which is a Sikh religious movement. And from there on, they make their journeys to communism. And they never actually give up either or. So it's not really a question of either or. So that's what's interesting about these entanglements in terms of ideas, in terms of imaginations, in terms of ideologies. And this was also how communism became part of the South Asian landscape. So that's the first part of that question. But the other part that you identified as translocal entanglements, I mean, I guess one way to explain that would be to, again, touch upon these large circuits of mobile labor that circulate the planet, Indian labor that move from one place to another in search of work and so on. And so I follow these individuals in their journeys to initially obtain livelihood. So this one individual, for example, who leaves India around the 1910s, lands up in Singapore, and then goes to Argentina in search of work. And then in the 1920s, he heads off to Moscow. And so that's how Southeast Asia, South America, India, and Moscow, they all become entangled in some ways. All these spaces that are not just spaces where individuals earn obviously their livelihoods, they're also spaces where individuals also learn and obtain their political trainings in some ways. That's in some ways that those are also political training grounds. And so in charting those spaces, they also exceed that otherwise binary relationship that we have between the colony and the metropole. And so, those lives then allow us to think about these entanglements, as you put it, in a different way. And so Moscow obviously is where any self-respecting revolutionary, has to go, especially in the 1920s. That's where the action is at. And so, it's at Moscow then where hundreds of Indian revolutionaries passed through from the very outset of the Bolshevik Revolution to the 1940s and the 50s and beyond, of course. That those journeys never quite stop. And just to give you a sense of what that world looked like to these figures, again, for the rest of you, Heike suggested a passage that I'm happy to read out that speaks of Moscow from the eyes of Dada Amir Haider Khan. This is just one paragraph. I won't take too much time after this, but it goes like this. In the 2 or 3 years that he was in Moscow, Dada acquired a comprehensive political education. Among the few memoirs that we have, his testimony is an unusually detailed account that touches on his education, military, and political training, university life, and travels in the Soviet Union, all woven together with an acute consciousness of the times he inhabited and of how they transformed him as an individual. There is also a distinct sense of pride at work in the way he speaks of his knowledge of Marxism, Leninism, history, and the social sciences. For the preparatory course, for example, Dada and his Indian comrades received lessons in Russian and an outline of political geography, economic geography, and anthropology. And these were accompanied by a daily reading of newspapers to acquaint themselves with daily political events and struggles. In more advanced courses, Dada learned about the history of the CPSU and the Soviet Union, histories of the first, second, and third internationals, revolutionary histories of Western Europe, histories of imperialism, Marxist political economy, and so on. And so, that said, it seems that Dada was one of the few Indians who received advanced instruction at Kutwa, which was the Communist University of the Toilers of the East. He was, professedly, one of the few who acquired a high degree of fluency in Russian. Some had to work through translators, others reported studying from Soviet professors fluent in Punjabi, Hindi, and Urdu. And this made their education all the more enriching. It also made it easier. But more than language, it was the material they studied that resonated with them. For another revolutionary, Bhagat Singh Bilga, Indian comrades found it easy to study in Moscow. Why? Because they were, after all, studying their life histories. And so this political education is accompanied by military education, but it's also accompanied by those other very small transformative encounters that may otherwise seem very small, but actually were huge to these individuals. And let me just give you an example, and then I'll end, which is to say that one of the things that Dada speaks of in his encounters in Moscow is his amazement at the sight of a Black comrade, an African-American comrade of the CPUSA, dating white Russian women. To him, that was inconceivable. And he could not believe his eyes because he had spent time in the American South, where that crime of an interracial relationship, could basically ended up usually in a lynching, as he puts it. But this was one space in which those very same men could actually enter into those relationships without actually being threatened by certain death. And so, these are some of the many daily small kind of like observations that he makes throughout the course of his autobiography that to him suggested that, this was the future. And this was the course in some ways of liberation that the Soviet Revolution had set for revolutionaries around the world.
Thank you, Ali, and thank you also for reading out these passages. I think the book is written in a very beautiful language, so I wanted you to listen also to the style of the book.